Alright, time to piss off the JoJo's community again. Let's get it. Giorno Giovanna from Jojo's Bizarre Adventure is far weaker than you think. I'll explain why. Ever since I started doing a bit of JoJo's content on my page, I've heard a lot of people making pretty absurd claims for characters like Golden Experience Requiem, Diablo, and a few others. I want to go ahead and take some time to address a few of these misbeliefs and maybe explain a more accurate way of interpreting this information. So for one, people have been arguing that GER hits some incredibly fast speed tiers like inaccessible speed. For those who don't know, inaccessible speed is, in simple terms, the speed necessary to travel between 2 points in 0 time, or in other words, traveling any distance and arriving there before even the smallest unit of time has passed. Some will even go as far as to say that he's faster than this with a speed tier known as immeasurable speed, which is basically when you're fast enough to travel to a location and arrive there before you even left, arriving in negative seconds. If you want more details on these speed types, by the way, I highly recommend checking out my friend Surfbone's video where he covers all of them. He's a good friend of mine and has videos that go into way more depth on these tiers and what they mean than I will in this video, so check him out. Now I'm going to explain why GER doesn't qualify for either of these tiers. First up, we have the argument claiming that he's either immeasurable or inaccessible speed because he moved and erased time. Look, I'm going to get this out the way. Diablo doesn't actually erase time.
But Kosu, it says everywhere that he erases time. Do you even know how to read?
Yes, I know it says that, but what's actually shown and the logic that follows contradicts this heavily. All his abilities allow him to do is see 10 seconds into the future for seeing events that are guaranteed to happen via Epitaph, and King Crimson allows Diablo to move freely while everyone is stuck unknowingly doing what Epitaph foresighted. You could also argue that he's just manipulating someone's perception of time rather than time as a universal constant, since as a result the events that occurred during those moments were not perceived by those affected, hence why they were not able to recall back on those experiences. This would at least suffice as a consistent explanation to Diablo erasing time and provide less loops to jump through to reach a conclusion. With that established, let's talk about the main problem with this line of logic when we presuppose King Crimson erases actual time. Now, when we look at what time is and what it means to us, we often think about how things used to be compared to how they are now. Time itself is what we use to determine how quickly space has progressed from point to point. Understanding this, let's sidetrack for a second and brush over GER's ability Return to Zero and what it actually does. In this statement from Jojo Bizarre, an art book published by Shueisha back in 2014, Araki describes GER's ability as the following. The stand evolved when an arrow pierced Golden Experience's body. It has the ultimate ability to change the opponent's movement and will to zero. Those struck by the Requiem are returned to zero, even to death, so they repeat their death infinitely without ever reaching their true death. Couple this with what's shown in the series, and for some reason the community chalks this up to causality manipulation, or the ability to alter cause and effect. Now, if we're just looking at the events in the series by themselves, you could probably assume that this is some lesser or limited form of causality manip, which, to be fair, I'm also inclined to believe this could be the case, but just know this is what is actually explained about the ability. Now let's say for simplicity's sake that it is affecting causality. Think about what that means for a second. When we talk about cause and effect, there's a universal understanding of what that is. Event A happens producing a result, event B. Now, in order for the production of this result, or event B, to exist, event A has to exist. Pretty simple to understand, however, what most people overlook is that time is an essential prerequisite for this universal rule to be applied. That said, let's jump back to Diablo. The popular notion behind King Crimson's ability is that he removes event A and only leaves event B. Let's go with that and assume that's true. If King Crimson's ability truly eliminates event A and GER's ability reverts the events, then how did Return to Zero even work? How can you revert an event back to its prior state if that prior state no longer exists? Since that hole exists within that logic, it's clear that Diablo just doesn't erase actual time and eliminates the perception or experience of time with the explanation I've given earlier. Now that we've gotten the important point out the way, let's talk about the supporting evidence I have to add to this logic's consistency. Another issue with believing King Crimson erases actual time is that tangible things still happen during those apparent erased events, such as King Crimson dodging Mista's bullets and Sticky Fingers punches, King Crimson throwing blood on Giorno's face, proving he can still interact with them mid-time erasure, which, by the way, I know they state this is possible from the description given in Jojo Bizarre, however, I don't think this excuses it from nonsense just because the author said it's possible. And lastly, the blood droplet method. The fact that this is even a viable counter to the ability creates a massive hole in this line of reasoning, as the blood drops increase in quantity after time was erased. I've expressed this in a video prior, but unless you're wanting to claim that these characters' hearts operate at these ridiculous speeds as well, the argument has quite a few holes. Not only that, but King Crimson also moves relative to everything within those events like the bullets and Sticky Fingers punches, which again, this ability only allows him to move freely from the 4-sided event. The only reason that GER was able to move independently of Giorno during this time was because his ability Return to Zero was already in effect as a reaction that hard counters King Crimson's time erasure. So no, he didn't move and erase time. And even if this were to be the case, it still wouldn't qualify for immeasurable speed via the definition we've established earlier. So please stop arguing this. Next up, we have the Made in Heaven argument. Made in Heaven accelerates time, so his speed should correlate to the accelerated time. Though it's not as popular, I've heard this before and I can somewhat understand why people would get confused by this, but if you actually know what constitutes as immeasurable speed versus what an ability can do for you, you would know why this is wrong. Made in Heaven accelerates time for everyone but himself. He doesn't accelerate his own base speed beyond linear time. To add to that, he was blatantly affected by time stop. Even if for a short period, it still worked. So yeah, no, there's no strong argument here. If he truly had this level of speed to move in 0 seconds or less, then time stop, which literally is the ability to make 0 seconds pass, wouldn't have affected him at all. Alright, now we're gonna talk about the Jojo Gogo and Jojo Veller arguments that most of the JoJo's community have held close to their hearts for ages. I'll also go into why I believe using these and stand stats can get a bit contradictory, as a lot of the arguments that are based around these guidebooks are heavily dependent on context and often get stretched. One of the more popular arguments is that Requiem stands are immeasurable speed since they can't be measured by the standard measuring rod, which includes infinite speed ratings. Look, I'm not too upset at people for thinking this, but it just shows you don't read into things much. Just because it says it can't be measured doesn't mean that these characters are beyond an infinite difference in terms of stats. And there's nothing in JoJo's that even remotely shows these characters time traveling via sheer speed or stating their speed is above time itself. Plus the fact that Chariot Requiem exists as a Requiem stand and has normal stats makes this statement very odd and a bit contradictory. The main issue with going by stand stats is how we interpret them for scaling purposes. I'll be honest, I feel like GR fans are the only ones in the JoJo's community that try and bend these statements and stats in their favor without actually analyzing the material properly. I mean, y'all are kind of as bad as Goku fans, man. And since we're on it, let's actually go a little further into the stand stats to elaborate why they low-key suck. For one, what do the stand stats actually mean? The stand stats are meant to be used as a reference to measure and categorize where a stand's abilities and or capabilities should sit at. The issue is, people often try to interpret these stats as if it's only referring to the stand's physical capabilities with no consideration for other factors. For example, the speed rating. They mostly take this as if it's solely talking about how fast these stands are able to move, and in some cases like for Star Platinum I can agree, since the description in his stand card explains his physical capabilities in relation to the corresponding stats. Now let me ask you, how do we go about interpreting stands like the Emperor, Superfly, or Sky High? The Emperor has a B in speed and in range, but it doesn't move independent of Whole Horse. It's just a gun that Whole Horse shoots with. Obviously it's a bit more than that, but it doesn't act on its own, so is this just referring to the gun's specs? What about Superfly? It has an E in speed even though it's a stationary tower. So this literal tower that doesn't move is apparently relative in speed to Chariot Requiem, who is also shown relative to characters who are at the very least bullet timers, or hell, even worse if you consider these characters to be MFTL by Part 3 Polnareff scaling. And yet, to come full circle, a stand that's literally just a gun has a way higher speed rating than all of these characters. Kinda weird, don't you think? Now let's get into the whole GR stats say none stuff that apparently supports the idea that he can't be measured, meaning he's above all stands. Did you know we have other stands like Sky High and Rolling Stones that have the same none rating, but for one, aren't Requiem stands, and two, don't have any scaling to support those stats being above other stands? So what does none mean then? It could just mean that their stats can't be measured because there isn't a way of measuring these categories in specific, or the stats could pertain to their abilities which also have no way of measuring. This would make sense with GER and his ability to return to zero, since it literally does what the name implies. So how would we go about measuring such an ability via this standard way? We can't. It would make sense to just say none. It is blatantly obvious to anyone who doesn't have the Giorno brainworms that stand stats are super contextual and do not hold any predictive value.
Well, Kosu, how do we know they're not just talking about his capabilities like Star Platinum?
Well, because the description literally only talks about his ability, not his physical stats. This is also consistent with the Jojo Gogo statement that everyone loves to use, saying the ability of Requiem selected by Arrow is impossible to compare with the existing stand measuring rod. Even Giorno, the main body, doesn't know about the power that makes all willpower go away. Now let's say it was talking about his physical capabilities. What does that even mean if Sky High also has none stat ratings? Does that mean Sky High is then faster than every stand too? No, right? Because it's blatantly contradicted. It honestly comes down to whether or not we should consider these pieces of secondary information to hold value for power scaling, and frankly, I don't think we should via the plethora of holes and inconsistencies that framework leaves us with. Because let me ask you this, if the usage of this info is inconsistent and leaves holes in the argument while my interpretation doesn't provide inconsistencies but in fact fills the holes that the other argument has, then which side seems more logically sound? I'll let you answer that one. Lastly, I want to brush over something that I've addressed before. GER does not scale above characters in parts that are past part 5. I don't know why people think this. Yes, the translations for Jojo Go and Jojo Veller mention him being above existing stands. This only relates to parts that he actually appears in and possibly prior. To assert that this applies to later parts because Jojo Veller was made in 2014 and in the same book characters from later parts appear is extremely uneducated. There is no reason to suggest that the release date for a secondary source would dictate what statements apply to which parts. It's more consistent to assume whatever statements they have about certain stands apply for their appearance within their respective parts, especially when you have statements like this one about Star Platinum having the strongest stand ability in history and being unrivaled in part 6 straight from the manga, aka the primary source material, which contradicts the idea that GER is stronger than every stand in every part. Please stop arguing this. This idea only really exists because of the poor translations that part 5 had for so long. It is not some belief grounded in some nugget of truth. So yeah, these are just a few reasons why I believe going by mostly stand stats and databook statements can be a bit controversial than helpful. And I personally believe that actually evaluating feats from the original source material would be the best way to interpret how powerful they can be. In conclusion, GER isn't immeasurable speed, nor does he scale to 5th dimensional or whatever. Yeah, people actually think that, by the way, it's crazy. Honestly, the big reason why GER fans even care about these arguments is because without speed, the character is almost totally helpless. If he's fighting someone significantly faster than him who is strong enough to one-shot Giorno, which is pretty easy, then GER never gets the opportunity to use his ability at all. It does seem to be the case that GER is a stand which can act independently, much like the other Requiem stand Silver Chariot, but there is no evidence to suggest that either of these stands could survive without their host. And GER even seems to go out of his way to protect Giorno, implying that it needs him to stick around. Another out to the speed problem that GER fans like to try and use is that Return to Zero is passive and not activated. I don't think they realize how incoherent and impossible this idea is for this particular ability. Some good examples of what a true passive ability or an ability that is perpetually active with no need for reactivity would be like an aura that surrounds the host and kills whoever comes in it, or like Gojo's Infinity being an infinite space between himself and an opponent that slows things down as they approach. If Return to Zero was actually passive, it would be constantly returning to zero everything around it, constantly reversing the causality of everything near it, and it would be a totally and utterly uncontrollable and useless ability. If anything, it would screw Giorno over more than it would help him. It clearly doesn't work that way and has to be activated on specific threats to Giorno, and to claim that it operates outside of the capabilities of GER would be actually insane. Anyways, I think this video's gone on long enough. I want to thank Hashi, Kratos, and Webcam Parrot for helping me out with this. You can find their links in the description. I highly recommend checking them out. Also, shout out to Jobber for editing this. He also has a GR video which I've helped him with, so definitely go check him out. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or maybe want a video on where I think GR actually scales to, feel free to leave a comment. Oh, and don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe. Peace!